Good afternoon. Thanks for joining today. Today's topic is going to be top reasons why your company needs a vCISO. So three topics really to discuss this larger topic, if you will. Um, the history of the vCISO. I know it can be confusing for some folks that maybe you're new to the industry, new to IT, new to the workforce, whatever the case may be, where you've never really heard the title thrown around. I think there's been some misuse of the title, so we'll cover just some items there to get everybody up to speed. And then we'll transition into talking about what are the current and evolving needs for most vCISOs. Now, of course, just like everything else, this is going to be a general, broad kind of swath at what's needed. It's not going to cover everything. Every industry and every company is going to have a little bit of uniqueness to them, but we'll cover the most general, basic items. And then some risks and impacts for not having a vCISO, because we talk a lot about, okay, here's what you should do, but what really are the impacts if you don't do this? So the history is pretty simple. At one point, we didn't really have anyone in the cybersecurity role. If we look back anywhere from 20 to 30 years ago, most companies didn't even see cybersecurity as a field or a topic, positions that weren't required. Depending on how far you go back and depending on if you're in like DoD, some of the federal space, some of those agencies may go back 30, 40, 50 years, but they're talking about at the beginning of the internet, and they're talking about different computers themselves and things that you can do with vulnerabilities. So security was involved, cybersecurity came about, but I don't think it was widespread. So I'm looking at it really from around the 2000s, give or take, when you really started to hear about cybersecurity. You started hearing about attacks come up. And at that point, that just wasn't a position that was in most people's org chart. There was no reason to have it. So for me, I'm saying it was basically a non-existent position because the technology just didn't warrant it. And then all of a sudden, technology changed. We started seeing attacks. We started seeing attacks on certain platforms and operating systems over others. And then you saw people start creating what we call a Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO. Now, again, this one's a little bit tough too because there's not just one title. You'll see some organizations use Chief Security Officer. You'll see Head of Security, VP of Security. I mean, you'll see all different types of titles, but for the most part, they're all synonymous with CISO. And you'll hear me say CISO. That's also something that industry-wide, I don't think there's a collective agreement on how you call the position. So we went from nothing, and now all of a sudden we have a CISO. And the CISO's role was to come in here and basically present risk. But at the beginning, I don't think it was as much a business risk position for the organization, reporting to boards or reporting to C-suite. It was more of a sub component of your organization. It's a component of IT. Maybe it's a small department. It's really not business risk related at the time. It was more of, okay, we have a compliance requirement. Are we going to meet it? What do we need to do? Hey, we have vulnerabilities. Are we going to patch them? So it was someone to oversee security, but for the most part, it was individual to the companies and what were your specific needs as an organization or an industry vertical. And then at some point, we switched over to what I would call fractional CISO. And I think this one is really the term that never was fully adopted or taken on by folks, but is the most accurate. Because in our space, especially in the SMB space, you're looking at your org and saying, I have a need for a CISO. I need the knowledge, the expertise, but I don't necessarily have the budget, and I don't know if I have full-time work for this person. If I could hire a fractional CISO to come in for 10 hours a week, 20 hours a week, whatever the case may be, you get the same benefit, but you don't have to bring on that W-2 employee at full-time pay and benefits and all that kind of stuff. And by doing it in a fractional manner, it's also cheaper than going out usually and paying for like a 1099 contractor. So the role of the CISO evolving to fractional CISO made complete sense. How can we, as an industry, make sure that everyone has the knowledge and expertise that a CISO brings without having to, pay to hire one? And then at the same time, put money aside, do we have enough experienced, educated CISOs to meet everyone's need if everyone gets their own? And that probably is also, no, we don't, and we didn't, and we probably still don't. But then at some point, and it could have been around the COVID time, we started seeing the term fractional CISO turn to virtual CISO. And it made a lot of sense during COVID because we're all working virtually for the most part. However, that didn't mean it was any different than what the fractional CISO was doing. So you may have been working remote for a company all along, and you may have been working part-time, fulfilling some certain number of hours per month, but all of a sudden it became vCISO and virtual CISO. Now, the one nice thing about it being called vCISO is it aligns with other industry terms like vCTO, vCIO. So if the industry as a whole is adopting this V or virtual aspect to these C-suite titles, then there's at least some consistency. But within your organization, and as you look at the industry, vCISO to you could mean lots of different things. One of the things that I see happening a lot is people saying, I need a vCISO because I have these specific requirements. But then when you add up all of these requirements, you're expecting one individual to have the knowledge and expertise to fulfill those for you, when in reality, you probably need 2 or 3 or 4 different experts, taking a little bit from each one. And that's where I think the fractional CISO term is more appropriate, because you can go out and hire fractional CISOs for exactly what you need. Now, again, because we've adopted the virtual CISO title, the vCISO title can be applied the same way. We could hire multiple vCISOs or a team of vCISOs to meet our needs. And again, that opens up a whole nother area of discussion as to what would those requirements be, what organizations staff enough people with the right experience to meet your needs, because again, finding one person to do everything is difficult and also presents a single point of failure for your organization. So at this point, now that COVID's done, I think the virtual aspect isn't as large, but I think we're still using the term virtual because, one, they're not necessarily on site. Two, it's kind of being swapped out for the term fractional. So I think either one are good. If you called up and wanted to speak to somebody, you want to hire someone and you use either term, it's going to be accepted. But I think right now, just the coined phrase is virtual CISO. So talking about some of the needs. So there's a lot, and I wanted to keep this slide where we didn't have 400 bullets on here. So I tried to wrap them up into groups that made the most sense for the most people. And at least under the current needs, I tried to put them in order of the things that I'm asked for the most, or the ones that are the most common, or if you had these skills, these are the ones that would be the most prevalent in the industry across all of our customer base, and I would assume most customer bases. And that's just industry best practices and mandates. I can't tell you the number of times as a vCISO you're asked, well, I work in healthcare, I work in finance, I'm a law firm, I'm a manufacturer. What am I expected to do? And a lot of times it's because there's a federal mandate that came out, and the industry as a whole hears, okay, this federal agency put out this mandate, you must comply by this date, and the organization scrambles to say, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And I know there's change coming. I have no idea how it's going to affect me, what it's going to cost, how long will it take, etc. And this ties with compliance frameworks, but I broke them out because there's a difference between having to be audited to retain and maintain a compliance certification and having to align with, say, executive orders and federal mandates and industry best practices. So these two comprise the biggest portion of what the vCISO does today. Again, in my opinion, the role is more of a consultant role here, saying, okay, for your industry, here's what you need to do. And the biggest piece of all this is interpreting controls and saying, here's what the intent of this control is. Now, how can you, as this unique individual organization, meet that control as quickly, cheaply, and easy as possible? The vCISO does have to have a thorough background and understanding of IT and technology. I say this for all of cybersecurity and every cybersecurity position, but vCISO being that foremost expert and consultant for an organization, where the organization is going to make business decisions based on what this person or group of people say, this is paramount. All of cybersecurity relies on the underlying IT technology. So how can I come tell you how to secure operating systems if I don't understand the operating systems and how they work? And the same with how a network works and a database and those kinds of things. So that's another reason why having multiple vCISOs on a team is important, because I have to be honest and admit, I don't know every area of IT. I don't know every area of cyber, and I can't give you advice on everything. So I have my lane that I work in, and when I have to step out of that lane, I actually would recommend somebody else. we're seeing more and more cybersecurity insurance come up. So a company gets either a quote for cybersecurity insurance, or they already have the insurance and they want to lower their premiums and their deductibles, or they're getting something from another company saying, here's what our cybersecurity insurance provider wants you to fill out, kind of that due diligence form, that third-party risk, so to speak. And they're looking at those questions and saying, I simply don't know how to answer them. Most companies could look at those forms and say, if it asks a question like, do you have next generation antivirus? They can look at their agreement with their MSP, or they can look at their computer or with their own IT company, IT team, excuse me, and say, yes, I see that I have this particular antivirus, and I check the box. But then when it starts getting into more detailed questions is where they tend to not have the answers. So the vCISO is going to do a lot of background work into what does the company pay for, how is it being deployed, how are they utilizing it specifically. And when we're seeing more and more that the questions are getting more granular. So it may start with, do you have X? And then if yes, what do you have? And then, okay, if yes, do you have this module? Do you have this function? So it's getting very granular, which in a way is a good thing, but it's making it more difficult, and it's requiring that a lot of companies reach out to get a vCISO. Training is also a big one. Most companies have an annual training requirement, whether it's for a compliance framework, a state, federal law, whatever the case may be. Just like HR has its own training, now cyber is becoming its own mandate. So a vCISO can come in there and once a month, once a quarter, once a year, whatever you need, provide training and check that box for you. Architecture is also a big one. We see this a lot on the vCIO side, and we're seeing it more and more on the vCISO side. So before you go do a big project like I want to move from on-prem to a cloud, if you don't have a CIO or a CTO or a combination of both, you're likely to reach out and say, I need a vCIO because this is a big project. I need to plan this out. I need to get the right technology. I need to do this properly. My business can't sustain downtime or has to be minimalized. So now the same thing's happening with the vCISO. If I'm going to make a move, if I'm going to create a big project, how do I make sure that the cyber security aspects are also taken care of? How do I make sure that when I make this move, I don't take myself out of compliance? Or does making this move help me better achieve compliance? So we're seeing a lot of architecture there. And again, when you get into the architecture space, this really then falls back on your understanding of compliance, IT, and technology. Because again, if you don't understand how to securely design and architect a network, how are you going to give someone advice? Pretty common basic things that we're talking about, but when you try to put them together and ask one individual to do all this for you, it's extremely difficult. Now, on the evolving side of the needs and how they go, this list is not in any particular order. But these are things that I see on a day in and day out basis now. So while they make up a small percentage of my time and other vCISOs' times, I think collectively they're starting to make up a much bigger portion of our time. So things like privacy laws. In the US, we have at least 13 states, maybe more, who have privacy laws in place. We have others in the process of adopting them. We don't, to my knowledge, have any mandated federal privacy laws in the US, but in the EU, they have GDPR, and other continents actually have their own versions of GDPR. So depending on where you work, what type of data you hold, where your employees are, your customers, etc., you could have a whole host of privacy laws, and they aren't the same. So a lot of them will contradict each other, have different requirements, etc. Data protection, that's huge for the vCISO because especially in the MSP space, there's, I think, a misunderstanding of who owns responsibility for protecting data. While you may pay an MSP to physically do the work for you, the data is still yours. So whether you work with the federal government or you have clients or whatever the case may be, those individuals still expect you to protect their data. Now, you farming out that work to someone else is acceptable, but you're still ultimately responsible when things go wrong. And I think a lot of organizations fall short on data protection and don't really understand their responsibility and the accountability, and therefore are missing one of the biggest and largest needs for a vCISO. So if nothing else, take away from this presentation that the protection of data is probably the most important thing right now on this slide. And if you don't have a good plan and process, please reach out and get in touch and see if a vCISO can help. AI and machine language, that's an up and comer in different spaces more so than others. We all see how this is making a difference in the industry. But again, from the vCISO perspective, folks are reaching out saying, what do I have to worry about? How can I use this safely? How can I ensure others feel confident working with me when I use these technologies, etc.? And that ties up very well with third-party risk management and vendor due diligence, uh, especially in the federal space. Anywhere that's heavily regulated, healthcare, for example, we're seeing a ton of third-party risk management and due diligence questionnaires come out. A lot more people asking questions about the security of your environment, your people, and their data. And just as I was saying a moment ago, when they send these questionnaires, they used to be something like 5 to 10 questions. They were simple. So I would have a customer send something over and say, could you fill this out? Okay, it's 5, 10 questions. I'm likely to be able to answer them in 2 minutes. Maybe it takes 5 if I have to look up a specific product that you're using to meet the requirement. Now we're receiving questionnaires that are anywhere from 200 to 600 questions in length. And there's evidence uploads, there's additional questions, there's interviews, there's back and forth. It is becoming a massive problem, in my opinion, because they're trying to solve a problem, which is no one's ever done a good job of managing this risk. But at the same time, we're just adopting questionnaires, and you have to answer yes, no, NA, or yes, no, other. And everything isn't just yes, no on these questionnaires. So a ton of work being done there, and there's a ton of hours that go into that. So if you know that you work in a space where you're either receiving these questionnaires or you're going to begin receiving them or you're going to have to start sending them out, definitely reach out for vCISO help because you may have the expertise to do it, but this might be a bandwidth problem. And the bottom three, I see these happening fewer than everything else on the list. But again, it's one of those one-off niche areas where that you might need, which is if you do a lot of work in the merger and acquisition space, are you acquiring companies? Have you been acquired? vCISOs are great there to help out with aligning what one company is doing to the other. Risk management in general. So if you have an ISO certification requirement, you have to have a risk management practice. Who's leading that for you? A lot of times it's easier to use a vCISO, fractional CISO, however you want to name it, to come in and lead just that component. And then board support. Again, when we talked about the history of the vCISO, remember we started off with this is just a person who tries to remediate security flaws for the most part, and now has evolved into someone who presents and manages business risk. So in this aspect of the role, you need someone who can speak to the board and can present your risk and have the CFO understand, okay, if I don't do X, Y, and Z, here are the implications. Same for general counsel. So this one again becomes really important. Really, the bottom three I'd say become very important in who you select as a vCISO. I think it's obvious and a given that you need a vCISO if you don't have someone sitting in this role. But then who do you select? And I think you should do a thorough job of not interviewing, but kind of interviewing the person or persons that's going to help you because you have a specific set of needs and you need to make sure that the people who are supporting you can meet them. Now, one thing that I would say that would help you out a lot up front would be come up with that list. So whether you use my list to start, make your own, come up with a list that of all the things that you need, rank them from priority of either what's most important or what you need the majority of the time. And then when you start interviewing candidates, or you're meeting with being introduced to a group of people, for example, if you're working with an MSP like Ntiva, then you can say, okay, who's going to take care of these things and who's going to take care of these? And then you start putting names next to them and you make sure you've covered all your bases. Last but not least, risks and impacts of not having a vCISO. Okay, the first biggest one I think is you might be out of compliance or fail to meet a mandate. There's simply so many laws and rules and amendments and appendices to these different documents that for an organization to know and understand and make sure they're compliant, it's difficult. It's a challenge. You really need, in my opinion, a full-time person doing this if you have at least one or more compliance mandates. Most people don't have anyone dedicated to that. And there's a difference between bringing in, say, an ISSO or an ISO, a system security officer, to maintain your compliance versus to get you to compliance. When you're already doing something and you have a set of evidence, you can bring someone in and say, just maintain this. And they have something to look at. They can say, here's what was submitted last year, here's what was approved, let me go do the same this year. That's vastly different than starting down the path of, I want to become compliant. Here's the framework, here's all the controls, interpret it for me and tell me what I need to do and make sure I have the right evidence. Those are two different skill sets, so you have to be very careful. The latter is where the vCISO really comes into play. Second, you're going to be blind to your organization's security risk. And I probably should have said business risk here as well, because security does equate to business. So if you don't know what's going on, if you don't know where you have weaknesses, you don't know where you're likely to be attacked, you don't know where you're likely to be sued, you don't know when or how much downtime you're likely to absorb, it's very difficult to then convert that into a business risk to get in front of a CFO, a CIO, COO, whoever. The lack of expertise to navigate difficult topics. This one, there's a lot of folks that maybe would question this one and say, well, within an organization, if you're big enough, a lot of different people have some expertise and it spills over into security, especially if they're on the IT side of the house. And that's true for the most part. But what I've found is most of the people who come in and have some experience have an experience from, I know how to interpret a vulnerability and then remediate. I understand the consequences if I don't do this, or I understand how the attacker would attack this vulnerability so I can help put a compensating control in. That's great. That's a piece of your security posture. But most of those folks don't have the knowledge to discuss all of the topics we talked about on the last slide. And again, if you don't have someone doing this, you're putting yourself at you're at risk and in multiple ways. And for your organization, you just need to look at how that applies. Number 4 one here, more costly in time, resources, and reputation to achieve your goals. Without a doubt, 100% of the time, I have never seen a company who does not have someone supporting them and does not have the internal person hired on working for them achieve their goals in the same amount of time for the same cost. You're going to spend time, resources, and potentially put your reputation at risk. And one of the biggest things that I see and ask of clients is most companies will not hire people and allow them to be 50% billable or 50% utilized. You're not going to sit around and just hire people that have lots of free time. So when you decide to take on something yourself, you're asking one or more people with full-time jobs whose work is probably at the 90 to 100, 110% utilized to then pick up another responsibility. If they can't get their assigned work that they were hired for done in a day, how will they pick up this work? And if this work is a requirement and it's a mandate and it takes priority, that means their other work has to suffer and be pushed aside. And what is the impact to your company? So many, if not most of my vCISO customers come to us specifically because they say it's cheaper to outsource it to the expert than it is for us to blindly figure our way through it and then try to figure out how do we do 2 jobs with 1 person or 6 jobs with 3 people, 4 people, whatever the case may be. So we see this time and time again. It's far cheaper in the long run to pay a little bit up front or a little bit each month to get you to where you need to go than it is to ask the people that you have today to take this on, because in the end, you're just going to end up calling and reaching out to someone anyway. So better to get ahead, better to save some money, and you will see some benefits and cost efficiencies long term if you do it this way. So hope this was helpful and beneficial to you. Look forward to speaking to you guys next month. Have a great afternoon. Thanks for your time.